Is it? Yeah. It's on.
I can hear you.
All right.
Do you need any screenings or anything?
No?
Okay. Anything? So you should be good.
That should be good.
I don't know if we're recording this. We probably should. Listen to that afterwards. There's no reason to turn it back off.
So we found ourselves wondering what was going on here.
Hi. How are you?
Yeah, they left. Last. They left every morning.
Really?
No, but they found us. They found a house, so they're.
But I heard about it yesterday.
What's the time, man?
It's supposed to be done in April.
And the guy who died,
It's already underway.
gets to, starts to.
It'll probably go like
I think it will
by the
close
time
on
we get there. I would anticipate.
And he said,
So, yeah, it's exciting.
hello, my name is Carl, big for them. And I'm a crew.
So is it close by for you guys?
It's,
Carl, the other
I
guy.
mean, it's 5 minutes away.
Oh,
It's a whole branch road.
Uh-huh, yeah.
The son of the pastor who just made
Yeah.
So he said, oh, I have that.
The lake?
And,
It's not on, they can see the lake from their front.
they got
It's
it
not on.
quickly. Yes.
Is it one of those neighborhoods that turn right on the whole branch?
No, it's actually right before you go over the bridge in North Carolina, where that new marina is. They are they're the last development on the left.
Are they in North Carolina?
No, they're in South Carolina.
I couldn't believe.
The state line is right here.
Yeah, it's right over that bridge.
I was up in Gilead, they were, they were possible there.
Maybe the construction will be finished.
Happy New Year.
Probably not.
Okay, sir. Service.
Oh.
Yeah.
We're on. That's the way I used to go to work when I worked in Mount Holly.
Oh, yeah.
It's been a long time coming. So, but they did,
Huge crowd. I know.
have they put their house on the market out there?
They just met with the realtor, so they're going to. We will see how quickly it sells. Should sell very quickly.
Yeah, the market is hot out there as it is.
It depends on where you are. I mean, California housing is so tight, even with the net outflow of people from California, it's tight. And where they live is very, that area isn't as affected, so. And they said, the realtor was telling them apparently that there's nothing in their range of the market right now, so. They'll sell fast. So we'll see. I don't think they're not too worried about it, so. But we shall see.
All right. Well, I'm sure some other folks will trickle in, but we can start. Pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this evening together. Thank you that we could study and learn from great figures of the faith, and we pray that it would challenge us to go further in our own faith. It's in your name we pray, Lord. Amen. So, Aaron had asked us, a few of us, so I think it's going to be, for the next 3 months, it's going to be me, Ryan Bowen, and Tommy Dixon rotating off. And he asked us to do, we're going to do biographies and overviews of the lives of great figures of the faith. So I'm going to start out with Jonathan Edwards tonight. But the idea was, so Ryan and I had been a part of teaching a class up at our previous church where we did this. And the goal was really just to say, hey, there's a lot, sometimes we don't look as much at the the history of the faith as we should. We go a lot to the Bible, but we don't look at how folks have lived out the scriptures before us. But one thing that I did was I went back through my notes is just thought about, why do we consider certain men or women, or women too, of the faith to be great? It's interesting that certainly they obviously had some enduring accomplishments, right? Because there's a reason that we remember them. But it's interesting that most of the ones who I think stick out in our minds are people who wrote, right? They wrote things down, and so we remember them because they had an impact that went beyond their direct interactions. I think, you can probably think of some who, maybe had something written about them. I'm thinking of there's certainly some missionaries who had things written about them that they might not have written themselves. You think about, one that immediately pops to mind is Jim Elliot. Obviously, there's some things I think we have that he wrote, but he didn't write a book, but certainly Elizabeth Elliot wrote a bunch, and so we remember Jim Elliot's life, right? Probably more than some other missionaries who were martyred. But by and large, the people that, I think we think of are, I know Ryan's going to talk about Spurgeon, I'm talking about Edwards, I'm going to talk about Kuyper later, Abraham Kuyper. They're all people who wrote. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind, is that sometimes that we think the people that we think of as great men or women of the faith are people, disproportionately people who wrote. And I think that's worth keeping in mind, because sometimes it skews our perception of what it means to be great in the faith. And I think that we have to remember that ultimately giants of the faith, or people who are great, are men and women who are men and women of the word and prayer, right? That's really the foundation. And certainly the people who wrote were also that, right? Who we would consider great as well. But their memory might be a little bit more pronounced in our minds because of those writings that stay with us. But I was also impressed, as I was thinking about all of these folks, by the sovereignty of God in their life. I think as we go through these lives and we see how God orchestrated them and orchestrated events, we'll find that they didn't become great because, as often the world tells us, they said, I want to be great, and therefore they charted a path to get there, and they got there, right? They kind of stumbled into it. I was remembering, I don't know if somebody will do Calvin, but I was listening and heard, I say I was listening, but as I say that, I remember it was one of my kids telling me they'd been learning about Calvin this week, and how he had been holed up in a hotel in Geneva and kind of being reclusive and not wanting to go out, and a man came and knocked on the door and basically challenged him, and that's what led him to go out. And he was a fairly young man, I think early in his 20s. But you think about that, and sometimes we think of somebody like a Calvin as somebody who was always out there fighting and fighting for the faith, but even he at some point in his life had to have somebody, God used somebody else to push him in that direction. So I think remembering God's sovereignty, and in that, remembering that God has a place for all of us, right? I certainly have been discouraged sometimes, thinking my life doesn't live up to the giants, and maybe some of that's good, right? From a moral perspective, I certainly fall far short of where I should be. But I think I had a note written here that said, while these men and women were great by the world standards in a sense, and I mean that not by the world standards in the traditional sense, but by our worldly standards, even of the faith of greatness, right? They were prominent, meaning prominent maybe is a better word, that we can fulfill our God-given purpose by being faithful in our calling. I always remember, I probably have told this story before, but one of my mentors growing up was from the Midwest, and he said there's some little old lady in Iowa. He had been a missionary to Russia and started a whole ministry and everything, and he said there's some little old lady in Iowa who just gets on her knees every night and prays for hours for missionaries around the world, and he said that woman's going to have more crowns in heaven than I will, because she's been faithful in her calling far more than I have, was his statement. So I think that there's a sense in that our being great does not mean we have to model these lives, right? In every respect. But we should be provoked and uncomfortable when we see that these people, how they were faithful, right? And be challenged to be faithful in our own lives. We're also going to cover, or I will, aspects of these individuals' lives that weren't that great. They all had certain thorns in the flesh or shortcomings. We'll certainly talk about some of Edward's tonight, and quite frankly, I was telling Chantal earlier, it's probably going to bleed over into next Sunday as well. So ultimately, these lives point us to Christ, right? The goodness and the need of redemption points us to Christ, which is certainly the theme of all what we want all our studies to be about. So, first off, how many of you are familiar with Jonathan Edwards or have heard of him before? Most of you, yeah. What are some of the prominent things that come to mind when you think about him? If nothing, that's okay too, other than that he was a great Christian man.
Well, one would be his involvement in the Great Awakening.
Yeah.
That was one. The thing that, and you may end up covering that, is that what has stuck out in my mind is that when he was booted out of his church, then a man of the stature of Jonathan Edwards went to the Indians and was resolved to teach the gospel to the Indians. And someone has said that the intellect that Jonathan Edwards was given has not been given to the church since, which is really quite something to say. If you see all the volumes that he
Yeah.
wrote, and then he goes to the Indians, which I'm not trying to say bad things about the Indians, but they were an untaught people. And he was content to just go there and minister to them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think he certainly, most people probably assume that he was fairly prominent given his fame, right? But he's he was kicked out of his church, for one, went to what was then the frontier, which was central Massachusetts, central to western Massachusetts, but the wilds. And he was brilliant. Certainly. Anything else? Yeah, I think what a lot of people would say, they would either say, what Leo just said, that he was perhaps certainly the most brilliant American theologian, and probably there has not been a theologian of his brilliance since he died. Is kind of the statement that most often gets made about him. The other thing that's really known about him is that he wrote a famous sermon called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," that often gets, I would say, parodied unfairly from both people within the church and people without. And so I remember reading it for the first time in high school and thinking that was, it's a bit unfair how it gets caricatured, even before you go to the entire corpus of his work. But I think that there's a lot that we can learn from Edwards. And so what we'll start out with is I want to provide some historical background, because I think sometimes we forget what was going on in history at that time, and that can help provide a backdrop for what's going on. Leo talked about the Great Awakening. We'll certainly talk about that. But there's a lot of what what was going on that certainly still influences the American church today. I think there was a lot that happened during Edwards' life that's distinctive, that understanding it from a church history perspective also helps us understand why the American church is the way it is today, and how that differs from the church in other parts of the world, but also that I think has informed the church in other parts of the world as well, as America has sent out missionaries. So it's important to understand, just to understand contextually where we are as the church. But Edwards was born in 1703 in East Windsor, Connecticut. Again, that wasn't, today we don't think of New England as the wilds. I mean, if you look at a map that has the 10 most densely populated places in the world today, going from about Chicago and curving up around the Great Lakes up to Boston is one of the 10 most densely populated regions in the world. Interesting note, America is one of the only countries that has both one of the 10 most densely populated regions and one of the 10 least densely populated regions in the world. But we don't think about, so today I think we think about that area and we say, oh, there's a lot of people. Back then it was the wilds, the frontier. And so he was born to a pastor who had gone there to plant a church. He died in 1758 in Princeton, New Jersey. He was the president of the College of New Jersey, which became Princeton University. And he was also, an interesting note given our current context, he actually died because he was inoculated for smallpox as an example to his church members and the people at the college. So that's just interesting given what we're going through now as a society. But what was happening around the world at this time? So, we all know in 1492, Columbus came and, landed in the Caribbean. So he introduced the Americas to the Europeans, whether you want to, we say that, but potentially in a broader sense he introduced them, because obviously there was the sense in which the Vikings had discovered Newfoundland long before. But that's an interesting, but that's the backdrop, right? So in 1607, so roughly 100 years later, Jamestown was founded. Jamestown being the colony in Virginia, and that was a commercial colony, right? But so if you think about the South or Virginia, that was founded with a commercial impetus. But then we look at Plymouth Colony up in Massachusetts, that was founded with a religious impetus, right? It was the Puritans had left, they had gone to Holland, not found the type of religious freedom that they wanted, and so then they had gone back to England and then gone to Massachusetts to start a colony, and so they started 10 years later in 1630. They founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. 6 years later, Connecticut was founded. What was interesting was that in 1685, in the backdrop of what's going on religiously, in 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of, I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but Nantes. And so the Protestants fled from France. So the Edict of Nantes was an edict that had been granted approximately 100 years before, that had granted the Protestants, the Huguenots in France, as they were called, the right to religious freedom within that. So you begin to see that there's these religious wars happening and a lot of religious persecution happening in Europe during this time. So a lot of Protestants were suddenly being killed or hunted or brought up on charges or discriminated against in France. In 1688 and 89 through 89, Mary II and William of Orange, so William and Mary College in Virginia is named after them. but they obtained the throne in England through the Glorious Revolution, which they replaced the Catholic James II, who had, if you're familiar with Oliver Cromwell, he had taken the throne back from Oliver Cromwell after his daughter, I believe. So again, there's this, one of the foundational points of European nations at this point is, are you Catholic or are you Protestant, right? That's a tension that's going on. Meanwhile, back in the United States, in what was not yet the United States, but the English colonies in the States, from 1692 to 1693, you had the Salem witch trials, right? So there's that going on. Not, the occult there was at least fear of it, if there weren't actually some practice of it. But an interesting thing as well, so Harvard was founded around 1640, and a college that was very influential in Jonathan Edwards' life, because that's where he got his degrees, Yale, was founded in 1701, so 2 years before Jonathan Edwards was born. And it was founded to train explicitly Calvinist ministers because Harvard was becoming too liberal, which is an interesting historical note. In 1712, there's a, and most people don't know this, but Jonathan Edwards spent some time in New York, so it's interesting to note, given the fact that he owned slaves. There was a slave uprising in New York in 1712, which is a historical note that often, I think, gets forgotten, that there was a decent number of slaves in the northern colonies. There's a bunch of other notes, but one of, in 1724 to 25, there was the Father Railes's War, which was not the French and Indian War that maybe some of you are familiar with from grade school history, which was where George Washington gained military prominence. That was actually 1755 to 1763, the French and Indian War. But Father Railes's War was in New England, and it was specifically versus the French and the Abenaki Indians. So there's, again, the backdrop, I think it's important to keep that in mind, that the backdrop of what Leo was talking about, where Jonathan Edwards went to truly the frontier to be with the Indians, it wasn't just a sense in which there's this very smart man who's going to be with some uneducated, it would be like going to Papua New Guinea today or something like that, where you have to train the natives to read and write because they haven't been educated, to really teach them the Bible and learn a new language and all of those things. There was also the danger of the fact that this was frequently a war zone. Still, it was the frontier. But then in the 1730s and 1740s, you had the Great Awakening, an evangelical revival that involved, John Wesley was heavily involved, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards. So those were probably the three most prominent pastors or preachers in that movement. And then in 1776, you have the Declaration of Independence. So again, you've got which comes after Edwards, right? So I think I include that note because it's important to understand that Edwards was firmly in the pre-American or United States of American mind frame. So he still saw the colonies as firmly connected to Europe and under the authority of Europe, which I think sometimes calling him the most prominent American theologian obscures that fact. We forget that he still considered himself a very loyal British subject. The other thing that's interesting from a historical perspective to keep in mind that's extremely important for Edwards, given Leo talking about how brilliant he was. He wasn't just brilliant from a theological perspective. He was brilliant. He actually could have probably, a lot of people have said, become a brilliant scientist. If you read some of his observations and put them up against of nature and put them up against other observations of nature by scientists at the time, they compare very favorably, and they're very astute. And so, but that gives to the point that from around the 1690 through the 1700s, we have the Enlightenment going on mainly in Europe, but it obviously sent shockwaves everywhere throughout the European sphere of influence, which would have included the American colonies. And so the Enlightenment was one of those things where it was the, it's been called the dawning of the age of reason, which I think is overstating it a little bit, but it certainly was the foundation, the discovery of the scientific method, right? So you have people like Sir Isaac Newton, who were observing the world because they believed that God reveals himself through nature, so we can find out some truth, not just about the world, but about God by observing nature. And so they came up with a scientific method, and so, but like all of these sorts of things, the devil or the evil one, or just fallen sinful humans get a hold of those ideas and they use them for their own purposes. So you have the good Enlightenment, which some have called the Scottish Enlightenment, going on, and then you've got the Enlightenment in France. And the Scottish Enlightenment, by and large, even by people like David Hume, who might not necessarily be known as a Christian, was firmly tethered in a view of God and a view of creation as being underneath God, and they didn't really try to disconnect that, even if maybe there were some seeds that they sowed that later did. But the French firmly took it and disconnected rationality from God, and that ended with the French Revolution. They even tried to take the week and make it a 10-day week. They also, that's the foundation of the metric system when they started the metric system as well. So there's a lot going on that's really earth-shattering and during this time, and a lot of new ideas. And Edward was a voracious reader of books, voracious reader of the news, even though the news then could be months delayed when they would read about events that would happen. It certainly wasn't an iPhone alert age. But he was very involved in all of these things, thinking about them and thinking about how does Christianity fit into this new world that's elevating human reason, that seems to have unlimited potential now for humanity to discover the world, to create new innovations, to discover new areas of the world, right? He's certainly living in what was then called the New World. And so there's a lot going on, The other historical note is if you look at what was going on in the American colonies, and I wish I had a map or a whiteboard, but if you think about New England was dominated by congregational churches at the time. So even we call Edwards a Presbyterian, but even, or we claim him as a Presbyterian, but even a lot of the churches he was a part of were congregational. They were not Presbyterian, they were more like independent Presbyterian churches that we talk about today, not what we think of like we're a part of Fellowship Presbytery, that's a part of the PCA. That wasn't really the type of Presbyterian church that Edwards was a part of, because New England was heavily congregational. It was also heavily Puritan, which definitely influences Edwards' view of faith and life in general, both for good and not so good. The middle colonies, which would have been, some say New York, but certainly Pennsylvania, down through Maryland, Delaware, that was a mixture of Quakers, Dutch Reformed, Anglican, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Congregational, Baptists, and then there were some Catholics. Maryland was originally founded as a Catholic colony. And so a lot of these colonies, some of them had more religious freedom than others, but they would be founded with a charter, usually with kind of a colony religion, official colony religion, like European nations had state religions, right? And that's how it started, and that's actually one of the reasons why the Constitution declared freedom of religion. You had to get all these colonies to come together because they all had such strong associations with particular religions. And most of them had come because even the Catholics, because they couldn't practice their faith in their home country as they wished. In the South, the state religion was Anglicanism, but there were a lot of Baptists, a lot of Quakers, and certainly a lot of Presbyterians, as we know. But the Enlightenment was also, as I alluded to before, bringing a rise in atheism for the first time. I mean, there weren't really atheists before this time in the world. And so atheism was a new idea. That was still pretty nascent, but certainly deism, many of the founding fathers were deists who believed in a distant higher power, so to speak, but certainly not a personal God, and certainly not the personal God of the Bible. And then there was Unitarianism and Universalism, which a lot of it was coming out of Boston, and Harvard at the time was there, which is kind of the anyways to God type of strain of thought. So all this is going on and in the midst, or in various degrees, when Jonathan Edwards was born in 1703. So his father was, as I said before, a Puritan pastor, Timothy Edwards. His grandfather was also a pastor, Solomon Stoddard, who was a very prominent pastor in New England. And Edwards spent his youth, he struggled because he would always get caught up in movements of the Spirit. Remember, the Great Awakening was starting to go on during this time, and these movements of the Spirit would prompt small revivals, where there would be a revival in a town, and people would get caught up in it. And when he would do that, he'd get caught up in the emotions of this as well. And then he'd go into the woods, he'd build secret places of prayer. I think of them as his versions of childhood forts. And he would even do so with his friends, but then he'd find that over time, as I think we've all experienced, that those feelings would fade, that they'd go away. But this was very deep within him, that religion was experiential, that knowledge of God was experiential. And his father even denied him entry to the church when he first asked, because when his father interviewed him, as children are interviewed in our church for entry into the church, covenant children, his statement was that he was overwhelmed by the beauty and glory of God. That's what he talked about. And this is one of the things actually that I love about Edwards' writings, is how he kind of takes the doctrine of predestination and irresistible grace and really makes God's irresistible beauty the linchpin of it. I think that it's a very interesting thing and true twist on that. But he talks about the beauty and glory of God being manifested in nature, which if you look in Romans, we would say that's certainly a biblical concept. God can stir people's hearts through some of that in conjunction with the ministry of the word. But conversion narratives at the time, and certainly this is a caricature of the Puritans that's based on some truth, is that you had to feel crushed by the law for that to be a valid conversion narrative. So you had to say, man, I felt the whole full weight of my sin. I felt like I couldn't escape. I was just crushed by it. And then I found this freedom in knowing Jesus. Not that that's wrong, but his father was very suspicious because his conversion narrative did not fit that. and so denied him entry to the church. Later on, he obviously was admitted. But that was a big part of the backdrop that's important for understanding his fascination with nature later on, as well as how he interprets the Bible. When in 1716, so when he was 13, so this is where we have to adjust our expectations a little bit. When he was 13, he went off to college and did his undergraduate and master's study at Yale over the next 6 years. So Yale was a very small place at the time, but even there, he didn't quite fit in with his peers because he was very pious. So he strictly observed the Sabbath, wouldn't do some of the normal college student gallivanting of the time. I guess doesn't seem to be quite as raucous as today, but it seems like the youth have always been the same. And he had an almost single-minded interest in studying. So he was always with his books, always studying, and I can identify with the nerdiness of that and how alienating that can be. But in 1723, he wrote, but he graduated, and then in 1723, when he was still struggling with post-college, post-academic life, what do I do with my life now? Where am I going to go? He writes the Spider Letter, which is a pretty famous letter in the corpus of his writings that has detailed descriptions of the behavior of spiders, and then a philosophical discussion. It was common at the time not only to describe that, but then go on a philosophical discussion about what does this teach us about the world, or what can we learn from this? And he wrote that letter to a fellow of the Royal Society in England, which was very prominent. Isaac Newton's a member of this, a prominent scientist. That's the level that we're talking about. And it's likely, though we don't know for sure, that he was hoping to have it published in the Journal of the Royal Society. And the letter wasn't published. So some people speculate that he was testing the waters to see, do I want to become a scientist, right? He loves nature, right? This is one of his fundamental, and not just for itself, but because it shows God's work in the world. It's God's creation, right? And so he's loving to study it, but his hopes were dashed because it wasn't published, and I don't believe we have a record that he ever even received a reply. So you can imagine, and remember, this is probably a year cycle where he's like, it takes 3 months to get there. It's not like waiting for somebody to get to their text in the evening before they go to bed. It was months and then months back, but he never got a reply. And so in the meantime, he goes to work with his grandfather at his grandfather's church. Yeah, Leo?
You just tied something together that never dawned on me before. In Jonathan Edwards' sermon, that famous sermon that he preached before the congregation, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, he has just tons of natural examples. And one of those examples is that you are hanging by a thread, a spider's thread, over the mouth of hell. And you just tied together his letter about spiders to his example in that sermon.
Yeah, absolutely. He's so in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, Leo was saying there's a famous illustration that you're like a spider over. Now, back then they didn't know how strong spiders' silk really is, but he's saying you're suspended like a spider over a blazing furnace, by a single thread. Well, this comes from his love of nature, right? His writings are just filled, and God actually used that knowledge to inform the pastoral illustrations that he would use later in his life, for sure. So in 1725, he goes to work with, kind of, what do I do with my life, right? He goes to work with his grandfather in the family business of being a pastor in Northampton. And this is a fairly prominent church there in west of Boston. And then 4 years later, he becomes pastor of that church when his grandfather dies. So again, it doesn't seem like he had this burning desire necessarily to become a pastor. He had a lot of different inclinations, but he definitely falls into it. And he just labors there quietly for about 5 more years. So keep in mind, he's been there 10 years at this point. And then in 1934 to 1935, there's a revival that happens in Northampton. I mean 17, yeah, excuse me, 1734 to 1735, thank you. There's a revival in Northampton. And it's not, again, keep in mind, this isn't Edwards saying, how do I get these people to have a revival, or what do I do, how do I tweak the music, or whatever. He's just faithfully, there was a small controversy about the Lord's Supper that we'll talk about later that ends up being his downfall at that church. But he's not, this is just pretty much smooth sailing. He's just going faithfully laboring, has been there 10 years, and the Spirit starts to work. And the Spirit starts to create this stirring in the congregation, and there's a revival. And it causes him to say, what is the nature of revivals? And so he spends a lot of time, he spends the next 4 years really thinking about this, and thinking, why do revivals happen? How does the Spirit work? What's the nature of that work? And in 1739, he writes something called A History of the Work of Redemption. And it has some interesting notes, like he's strongly post-millennial. He believed that the Pope was the Antichrist very strongly. But the real thesis of the work is that God has primarily worked through revivals and great preachers. And his theory is that basically he says that the way that God works is similar to, it's almost the opposite of the book of Judges, right? So if you're familiar with the book of Judges is a story of devolution, right? Where Israel falls into sin, they get judged, by God, he leaves them by leaving them to their own devices, letting them be persecuted by or conquered by their enemies. They cry out for a judge. They come back, they get elevated by a judge, right? They return to God. But they're not where they were, and then they fall back again. And so it's going down, even though there are ebbs and flows, right? It's going down, down, down. Edwards's proposition was that God primarily, remember, he's saying we're post-millennial, right? So if we think about Aaron's sermons on Revelation, and Leo, correct me if I say anything wrong here, but post-millennialism, one of the features of it is that we are on a trajectory towards the kingdom now, because we're past the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and now we're in the phase where God is completing his kingdom work. So we're not in a stage of stasis, right? We're stage of upward progression, not personally in terms of sanctification, but we're talking societally and the story of the world. So what he was saying is that the arc of history is through revivals and then backsliding. So but contra Judges, right? That basically what happens is God causes a revival, society takes a jump up, they start backsliding, and then there's another revival, and then it jumps up. So revivals almost take the place of the judges in the back. And at one of those peaks of revival, he believed Christ would come. Christ would return and inaugurate his reign. And then he said that God, a corollary to that, was that God works primarily through great preachers. And the interesting thing about this was there had been a lot of, there had certainly been great preaching before. I mean, Martin Luther could preach, different other people could preach, for sure. But it seems like this has had a lasting impact on American evangelicals, where we have elevated, and this is, some church historians have said, Americans elevate preaching to a level that the church before had not, in the sense that they ask the question, who is God working through today? and saying that the primary work that he's doing is through great preachers. And so there's kind of this crowning, the theory of this school of thought would say that that Edwards inaugurated this idea that we in the American church look for the next de facto kind of head of the church almost, who is the greatest preacher of the day. So Charles Finney would have been one early on. Billy Sunday is one who's stated, and then Billy Graham certainly is one who recently, I don't know if there's someone who's come in since Billy Graham went to be with the Lord, but there's a criticism of this, and I bring this up to say there's certainly many great aspects of Edwards' writing, but he's had a profound impact on the American church, and Robert Godfrey, who's a prominent church historian, he actually has a strong critique of this, and he says Edwards kind of introduced a wrong notion into the American church, whether he intended to or not. And he was saying God certainly works through great preachers, right? That would be undeniable. But the phrase that I loved was Godfrey said, God does most of his work through, quote, the settled ministry of settled preachers in settled congregations. That by, and the sense is that by elevating a great preacher to a stature that the devil has used that to distract from the ministry that's done in the local church, which is the primary way that folks' lives are touched. So that's just one interesting note. We'll get into some of the other writings of Edwards later. But did you have a thought, Leo?
No, it's just,
Yeah.
it brings back all kinds of stuff. When you piece his whole life together, how much is out there on Edwards. You mentioned Godfrey, but you also have George Marsden.
Oh, yeah.
Who's done a tremendous service to exploring the life of Edwards.
And next week I'll pass out a handout that has some resources, one of which is Marsden's book, another is a lecture by Godfrey that's very good. Edwards what was happening in Northampton was so powerful that Edwards, in 1743, he wrote that he thought the millennial reign of Christ might have come due to what was happening in Northampton, that the era God might be inaugurating the true reign of Christ on earth. But in 1750, he was dismissed as the pastor in Northampton because he was teaching that you had to show evidence of grace to become a member of the church and take the Lord's Supper. So that was his father's view, but there was a controversy in the church, which is still a controversy in the church. It was maybe even a bit more extreme than some, but it was saying that you have to fence the table, basically, right? That you have to show, you can't just claim to be a Christian, you can't just claim to be a cultural Christian, there has to be some evidence in your life. We still see this there are some denominations like the Reformed Presbyterian Church in North America that to take communion there, if one of us were to go to one of their churches, you actually have to come early on Communion Sunday and be interviewed by the elders about your faith and basically show evidence of that. So, Edwards was more to that side where he was saying, look, you can't just walk in and say, I'm a Christian, and take the Lord's Supper. Like, you have to show evidence of the Lord's work in your life and evidence that you're saved.
Charles Spurgeon was a big believer in that too. As big as his church was growing, he had this very detailed vetting process where he would, I think until it got to a building, he would sit down with people for hours at a time and just talk with them and kind of make a decision. And then if you didn't attend church for a couple months, you were off the roll and you weren't a member. So I mean, he was very structured kind of way about kind of guarding the church.
Yeah. I mean, if you study some of these older, pastors, they really took seriously, very seriously, shockingly seriously to, I think, some of our postmodern ears, the commands of Scripture to make sure that you are eating and drinking judgment on yourself if you eat or drink in an unworthy manner. But that's why he was ultimately kicked out of his church, because he said, no, his grandfather had taught that. He puts his foot down, and that ultimately led him to being kicked out of the church. So then Leo talked about this earlier. The next, he goes on a job hunt, can't find another church position around where he is, so he becomes the pastor in Stockbridge, which was the Wild West of the time, which was the, Chantal's laughing because she's from that area, up there in New England, but he's a pastor and a missionary to the Indians. So he's there for 7 years, from 1751 to 1758. In 1758, he then becomes president of the College of New Jersey, as I said, which was Princeton, after his son-in-law dies in that office. So there's a little bit of, he has some fame at this time, but also a family connection, so he gets pulled into that. And then, as I said, he died after taking a smallpox inoculation to show a good example to the community around him in college. So remember, he was he thought of himself as a scientific Enlightenment man, and so these new ideas about inoculation, he wanted to support he wanted to lend his support to them, and be a leader, he thought, in those areas. So if we look back at Edwards, in terms of his humanity, some interesting notes about him. He owned slaves. We won't talk much about that, but he definitely did not confront that issue. I think it's an interesting historical note, some of you may know this, but the reason why slavery died out in New England, which clearly it was there that's why I mentioned the slave uprising in New York, which that was something I didn't mention after college. Edward spent some time in New York. But the slave uprising there, as well as Edward's owning slaves, the reason why slavery ended up dying out up there is because New England developed as a mainly manufacturing center, and the soil was not conducive to large-scale agriculture like the South was. And so it was not a lot of things that people like to claim in history as being that they were on the right side of history ends up being external forces that force you into certain decisions that then maybe later get claimed as virtue that may not be. One of his problems as a pastor was his perfectionism. So he would spend 12 to 13 hours a day studying. There's some evidence he neglected his own children and family. And he expected others to as well. And he would doubt their conversion if he didn't see that level of devotion. So he held himself up, in a manner of speaking, as the yardstick for faith, and his own faith as the yardstick for true faith. In his writings, in his personal letters, you can find him haggling over his salary, negotiating business dealings, and giving home remedy advice to his wife and children. So despite all that studying, he was not a purely spiritual man with his head in the clouds. He also, an interesting thing to remember is finding paper was an issue for him. A lot of his writings are on scraps of paper because paper was just in short supply. So there's a lot of the normal stuff that he dealt with that we don't really confront today, thankfully. But there were a lot of things that he had to deal with. I think we have one of the things that you see that's a big theme at the time was that, you're starting to see independent churches really flourish for the first time. And you're seeing the good of that in terms of ideas flourishing, right? Edwards is allowed to write, to come up with different ideas. You see the Great Awakening happening and churches popping up. It happened in England to some extent, to a large extent, but it seriously happened in America because there were far fewer religious restrictions. And when I talk about restrictions, they could just be favoritism, right? Societal restrictions where the power structure, because of the state church, was associated with a particular religious system. But in Europe, you have the parish system, right, where you basically go to the church, a default church that is in your area, right? But in America, you had the laity involved in the church far more. As you see, it would have been virtually unheard of for a pastor to be kicked out of his church in Europe, like Edwards was in America. But the laity controlled the church in America, especially in congregational churches. And they voted with their feet, they voted with their wallets, and so there was pressure there. So that led to entrepreneurialism of pastors. This was a double-edged sword, right? One was Rodney Stark, who's a sociologist, Christian professor at Baylor. He's written about how he's linked this to the fact that America had far more church attendance. Even if you look at Europe, and they might have had comparable numbers of churches per population, their attendance was a lot less than in the United States. And part of that is because the pastors they couldn't just mail it in, right? They had to appeal to the people. But the flip side of that is sometimes you had congregations who kicked out faithful pastors because they had unbiblical views. The congregation had unbiblical views, I should clarify. And as part of that, the sacraments sometimes became a tool to bring people into the church versus a practice for true converts. So again, this is still a Christian society where people think of themselves as Christians. They want to go to a church where they can get the sacrament.